Greetings everyone, I am Enraged Eggplant and welcome to Dungeons and GURPS. In this video I will tell you how I make D&D wizards in GURPS. This is going to be quite complex under the hood, but the end result won't be that scary. Also, this is going to be one of the examples of how one can convert a concept, but not the exact mechanics. What is a D&D wizard? More importantly, what is a D&D wizard to you? A wizard is an arcane spellcaster who has attained magic abilities through intense study. Wizards prepare spells ahead of the time by studying their spellbooks and have spell slots, just like most D&D spellcasters. If you have played with GURPS magic, you probably know that it has a nice, scholarly flavor that just fits wizards. But we are trying to distance ourselves from magic as skills and somehow accomplish the same thing in the magic as powers framework, basing wizards on sorcery. Fortunately, GURPS Powers has just the solution for this: skills for everyone, where every ability is assigned a power skill that is required to use it. This way, when all spells have skills attached to them, the wizard still feels like a scholar who learns spells, not gains them innately. As a worked example of this, you can check out GURPS Psionic Powers. In short, you apply requires IQ roll to all spells that do not require an IQ roll by default. Spells that already require a roll but not against IQ get based on IQ own roll plus 20% instead. If the wizard lacks the skill, he can still cast the spell using IQ -6 as a default. Not only does this let wizards improve the effectiveness of their spells more than a skillless sorcerer would, but it also opens up a possibility of magical styles and spell techniques. Spell techniques basically are D&D meta magic, and I will cover it in a separate video. Wizard spells are specific arcane rituals, not some innate powers of the sorcerers. This is why I suggest forbidding alternative rituals from sorcery, and instead enforcing the ritual requirements, the verbal, somatic and material components of D&D spells. Those are done by applying requires magic words and requires gestures limitations to spells, each worth -10%. Material components are a different matter. If you want a spell to have a material component that is expended after the casting, you should add the trigger limitation. If you want a spell to just require you to hold a specific item that is not expended, then add requires item -10%. The latter is closer to the focus component of a D&D spell. Also, feel free to increase casting times and costs. If you want a teleport spell to be cheaper and harder to use, make it cost 6 FP, not 1. If you want raising the dead be a lengthy process, add immediate preparation required to the zombie spell. Specifics of components, costs and casting times are all up to you. This will add a bit more bookkeeping, as it will not be as streamlined as baseline GURPS sorcery, but it will also add a lot of flavor and ways to balance the spells against one another. One of my favorite things about GURPS magic is its prerequisite tree. However, this probably will not work in the magic as powers framework. How does it interact with improvisation? Is a spell considered to be known only when bought as a learned spell? Or is a spell that can be improvised considered to be known? No idea. Talent level requirements could work, but that doesn't really feel appropriate for wizards. Maybe a spell is considered known if the wizard has spent any number of points on the appropriate skill. Maybe that could work. In my experience, it is easier to simply abolish the prerequisite trees. I have not heard any complaints from my players about that. And now let's get to the most interesting and unique thing about wizards, their spellbooks. In my framework, wizards can cast their learned spells without preparation, like a normal sorcerer. Their improvisation, however, takes a long time and requires a spellbook, not a specific spellbook of the wizard. How do we do that? Fortunately, GURPS thaumatology has a limitation for modular abilities that represents that. Sure, it is made for magic skills in mind, but I can see why it would not apply here. Thus, we apply accessibility spellbook minus 20%, which is equivalent to spells only, to sorcerer's empowerment, not the spells. This way, the wizard will be able to improvise any arcane spell written in a spellbook. It can be his own spellbook or, for example, a borrowed, stolen or looted spellbook. I've seen many people suggest using a gadget limitations for this, but they simply would not work. A wizard with a gadget spellbook would only be able to cast spells from his own spellbook, and I do not want that. Let's also apply preparation required 1 minute minus 20% to sorcerer's empowerment. Note that this is preparation required and not immediate preparation required. So a wizard can study a spellbook for a minute to memorize a spell and cast it later once. And even if he switches to a learned spell, he will retain the memorized spell until he casts it or memorizes another one. These two limitations severely restrict the flexibility on the wizard in combat, but they greatly enhance his out-of-combat flexibility. You know, when he has enough time to study the spellbook. And you can still apply more limitations worth up to minus 40% to represent some sort of specialization. Now you might ask me, how does this work with skills that are attached to spells? This is where things get complicated. The first option is to leave everything as is, so improvised spells would require knowing the spell skill or casting it from a default. However, I came up with a solution that makes things much more bearable for the wizard. To increase utility, the wizard must be able to improvise an appropriate spell skill in addition to the spell he is improvising, but cannot improvise it past IQ plus 0 or Thaumatology plus 0, whichever is better. Basically, he cannot spend more than 4 points on it. To accomplish that, we make an additional linked modular ability for skills. The second slot should be static, it should only contain 4 points at all levels. Both slots must be rearranged at the same time, thus Sorcerer's Empowerment must get the link plus 10% enhancement. Then we create another custom modular ability with a base cost of 5 points and per point cost of 5 points. We apply preparation required 1 minute minus 20%, limited spells only minus 20%, link plus 10%, magical minus 10%, and reduced time 1 plus 20%. Note that we do not need physical plus 100% here. This gives us the total limitation value of minus 20%. As a result, this 4-point skill slot will cost 20 points. We will add it to the level 1 cost of the advantage slot. Thus, a caster with Sorcerer's Empowerment 2, total cost of 41 points, can improvise a 2-point spell and 4 points in the spell skill to avoid casting it at a default, or use hardcore improvisation to improvise a 37-point spell and 4 points in the spell skill, or a 39-point spell and 2 points in the spell skill, and so on. Note that talent applies to these spells too. All this makes only the first level of Sorcerer's Empowerment more expensive. It does not scale with levels. It makes investing in wizardry more difficult, but still worth it. Sorcerer's Empowerment for wizards will cost 34 points for level 1, plus 7 points per additional level. Due to this complex internal structure, it is not that easy to calculate the cost for specialized wizards with different additional limitations. But I did all the work and I will show it on the screen. Basically, each minus 10% of additional limitations removes 4.5 points from the first level cost and 1 point from the additional level cost. If you watch my previous videos, You might remember that I always advise to limit the scope of magic for all spellcasting traditions, but I also mentioned some exceptions. Wizard spellcasting is one of those exceptions. By default, they gain access to all arcane spells without any mandatory limitations that limit the scope further. This is compensated by the lengthy improvisation process, required skills, and the fact that you can only improvise spells from your spellbooks. So you will actually probably have to spend money to buy scrolls to transcribe into your spellbook. For example, in my game, spell scrolls that can only be used to transcribe a spell into your spellbook cost $2 GURPS per point of the spell's full cost. Transcribing a spell requires identifying it first. Transcribing takes 1 day per 20 points of the spell's full cost. Also, some spells might be restricted legally. GURPS Fantasy introduces MLC, Magical License class for spells, and you can use those guidelines to see which spells are available, or you can come up with your own license classes. To give the wizards something positive, I also allow them to use training fatigue for skill, from page 161 of GURPS Powers. If you would like to see a 150 point wizard template, I made one, the link will be in the description. I love this approach to wizards. I have run games with wizard players and played a wizard myself, and quite enjoyed it. There have been many changes to the framework, to make it comparable in terms of potential with other spellcasting traditions, and my players helped me a lot with criticism and suggestions. Basically, they tore my wizard apart and we all came up with this framework together. This is one of my creations that I am proud of. If you do not like, for example, the spell skills, you can do away with them and the additional modular ability slot for skills. I actually have played a wizard that uses this variant of rules, and it works fine too. Personally, the aspect of playing the wizard I enjoy the most is that treasure sometimes not only is just treasure, but it can also expand your scope of abilities. For example, all these magical scrolls you find in chests, arcane formulas engraved on the walls, they all can be transcribed into your spellbook for later use. And if you happen to defeat an enemy wizard, you can greatly expand your repertoire by claiming his spellbook. This collection aspect really appeals to me. And that's going to be all for this video. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.